Hello everyone, thank you for coming to our seminar today. I'm Sugawara. I work at the Hitotsubashi University Library in Tokyo. Today, I'd like to introduce our activities related to the core community framework. Please wait a minute until I share my presentation. First of all, I'd like to show you two statistics. One of them is the number of institutions in Japan that have built institutional repositories. As of last month, 875 institutions have an institutional repository. Please look at the red bar in the graph, and the number of institutions using the Gyro Cloud is increasing. Gyro Cloud is a cloud-based repository system provided by the National Institute of Informatics, and it's available for a fixed fee. So if institutions do not have its own repository, they can publish research outputs using this system. Look at another figure, 60%. In Japan, an annual survey of university libraries is conducted. One of the questions in the survey is, what issues do you face in running a repository? In response to the in response to this question, about 60% of the respondents said that they faced issues in maintaining operational structure of a repository and in clarifying the position of repository project within the university. And these answers are a bit abstract, but in order to gain an understanding of the significance of repositories within university, we need to evaluate current repository operations and then develop strategies for the future. Now, let's take a look at the tool for evaluating our repository. I'm going to talk about today is divided into three parts. As you may know, last year, COAR published a document called the Framework for Good Practices. We began our work on the basis of this framework, so I will first explain what it is about. And then secondly, we have translated the framework into Japanese and then have also developed our own checklist based on it. So we will explain the features of this. Finally, I have tried this checklist on my university's repository, so I'd like to show the result. Have you ever already read this framework? As a quick overview, this framework was published in October last year. It is designed to evaluate the operation of repositories by listing applicable and achievable criteria. We, from Japan, Mr. Minamiyama, and the first presenter, participated in this working group as a member. With difference to the existing frameworks listed here, core community framework has been designed so that it can be used in different types of repositories and in different geographical and thematic contexts. Let's check the perspectives from which the framework assesses repositories. As you can see on this slide, there are 9 perspectives in total. In order from top to bottom, these are discovery, access, reuse, integrity and authenticity, quality assurance, privacy of sensitive data, preservation, sustainability and governance, and finally, other characteristics. Under these headings, there are 45 requirements, and among them, 22 are essential characteristics, and the rest are desired ones. Since the publication of this framework, we have translated it into Japanese. We didn't start with a specific team name, but now we call it the Repository Criteria Team from JPCOAR. The team is made up of 2 researchers and 3 librarians. After publishing this translation, we thought that it was not enough to translate the framework into Japanese. We needed to make it available to the Japanese community for active use. So, therefore, we decided that the next step would be to create concrete checklist based on this framework. We have been working on this for a couple of months, and then at the moment, we have a checklist of about 70 items, 70 questions. Here is a checklist we created. There are 2 features. Firstly, we have tried to make the framework as concrete as possible, so that the questions can be answered with a yes or no answer. Let's look at an example. In 6.1 of the framework, it asks whether if a repository collects sensitive research data, there is a mechanism in a repository to restrict access to authorized users only. We have developed 3 related checks from this single sentence. Specifically, does the repository cover the collection of sensitive data? Does the repository have the ability to restrict access to resources? And if the repository has the ability to restrict access to resources, what methods can be used to control this? As a result of accumulating such questions, a checklist of 69 items was completed. Let's take another look at the feature. Keeping in mind that this framework is used internationally, if there are any circumstances specific to Japan, we have reflected them in the checklist. For example, in Japan, there are several schemas, 2 schemas called the JPCOAR schema and the Unit 2 schema that are used when creating metadata. As majority of institutions use these MAC schemas, we have listed them as options in the checklist. Now, I'd like to actually examine the repository of my university. Before that, let me give you a little introduction to the university. Hitotsubashi University was founded in 1875. It has 6 faculties, mainly in the social sciences, and in several indicators, our university occupies a leading position in Japan. Let's move on to our repository. Our repository was opened to the public in 2007. Currently, the repository contains around 25,000 research outputs. According to the pie chart below, the publication of university bulletins accounts for more than half of the total. And there are nearly 50 staff members in total in our library, and then 2 or 3 of whom, including me, are in charge of the repository. Here is the result of the trial check of our repository. I was surprised to find that there are more items that have not been achieved than I expected. Let me explain some of them. First, in terms of access, we have not been able to support accessibility for people with disabilities, and how to publish files of large size. Any files cannot be combined into zip file and then can only be downloaded individually. And then in terms of reuse, we have not displayed the Creative Commons licenses and a list of preferred formats, which the core community framework referred to. Furthermore, text and then data mining are also not yet supported. So for these reasons, the achievement rate for this perspective is low. In terms of quality assurance, we do not allow external annotations, comments, reviews, etc. on the resources and the metadata. And then finally, in terms of privacy of sensitive data, and the repository we handle in our repository, there are basically open access, so we do not handle such data in our repository. Therefore, our achievement rate was 0%, or alternatively, it may be better to answer not applicable. By applying the checklist like this, we can understand the strengths and weaknesses at a glance. Why not try such approach to your own repository? Through the framework, we can see global trends in the requirements for systems and operations of open access repositories. And through the checklist, we can make a more detailed assessment, including our own local situation. Through these, we will be able to evaluate repositories objectively in the light of global standards. And then I think that it leads to consider the strategy of repository. I'm reposting the slide that I gave at the beginning of this presentation. I explained that a number of institutions in Japan are facing issues in maintaining their implementation structure and then clarifying the position of the repository project. I believe that if we can understand repository's strengths or weaknesses and then improve its usability with the framework and then checklist, stakeholders in our institutions fully understand the significance of our repository. On the other hand, let's also look at our feedback on this framework to core. There are three perspectives. The first is about whether there are characteristics which are difficult to implement. For example, I mentioned that our university's repository has room for improvement in its disability support and third-party commenting function and so on. However, we don't think they are unnecessary at all. Although priorities are different in each institution, if we can solve the technical and budgetary issues, we would like to work on them in the future. The next feedback is whether there are criteria that are different to interpret. I dare to point out that 1.1 and 5.1 both seem to be about the quality of metadata. So actually, it was a little difficult for us to make a difference in the checklist between the two. But since 1.1 is a criterion from the viewpoint of discoverability, and 5.1 is a criterion from the viewpoint of quality assurance. So I think it would be good to create checklist with that background in mind. Finally, the third feedback relates to the appropriateness of the criteria. The operation of a repository is influenced by several elements, by staff, by system, by metadata, by institutional policies, and so on. Therefore, it would be easier to create a checklist if it were made clear in advance which of these elements each criterion refers to. When the criteria are revised in the future, I hope that the core will explain whether each criterion should be met by system or by policies, or by both, and so on. For your information, here is a brief history of our activity. We started translating in October last year. After 2 rounds of brushing up in February and this month, we would like to ask universities and then institutions in Japan to respond to the checklist by the end of this year. This slide is the summary of this presentation. Today's topic was about COAR's framework and the creation of a checklist based on it. The framework is a global and a multi-dimensional one designed to evaluate and improve repository operations. We, Japanese team, embodied this framework as a checklist according to the situation in our country. We found that this framework and checklist were effective, very effective, in identifying strengths and weaknesses of repository. This is the end of my presentation. Next presenter will discuss on how to use the results obtained by the checklist effectively. Thank you very much for participating.